Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this webinar series. Woodburn is proud to be hosting its third webinar series in 2018 on marketing to the Chinese consumer and protecting your brand and company in the process. If you're planning to market to the Chinese consumer soon, or you have already begun the process, then this is the series for you. Together with Dominica from Emerging Communications, a full-service Anglo-Chinese digital marketing agency, we are going to provide you with as much information as we can to help you in your first phase of your China market entry, which is to discover and build your brand. This webinar series is going to highlight the importance of protecting your brand before you have even set foot into the market, understanding who your target market is in China, how to create a viable and long-standing structure for your business so you can smoothly enter and flexibly expand your operations. And last but not least, learn and understand about the Chinese digital marketing world. Before we begin today's session, I just want to do a little bit admin. Now, you may find, if you are based in China, that you have to use a VPN. This is obviously due to the very popular Great Firewall. I am also currently on a VPN, and there may be some technical issues or sound that dissipates and comes in and comes out. Please don't leave the webinar. We will be recording this session, and the full recording will be uploaded to our YouTube page. Now, once you have launched into the session, you will be prompted to set up your audio. As mentioned earlier, you have two options within your audio section of your control panel. One is to use your computer audio, and the other is to use a landline or mobile to dial in. This is what should pop up. If you are looking to use a landline or your mobile, there'll be a phone number, an access code, and audio pin to then log into the session. Obviously, if you use your phone or a landline, there will be charges that have to be paid. There is a question section in your control panel as well. Please don't shy away from adding questions, adding comments into that control panel. Both Dominica and I are here for 4 days to give you complimentary free information on your market entry into China. So take this opportunity to ask what you would like to ask. And please don't ever think that there is a dumb question for China. I've heard everything possibly imaginable over the years. Please add whatever concerns, questions you have. We will have a Q&A. We will highlight the most popular questions that come up that kind of summarize the topic. If we don't get to your questions, don't worry. Dominica will be answering them later on today or even tomorrow or further along in the week. So let's just check that you're all listening in to me. If you would be so kind as clicking the hand button in the control panel, that will allow me to know that you know how it works. If you can then click it again so you can remove your hand, that would be fabulous. Great, everyone is paying attention. So let's begin with today's session. I am the moderator today, so I'm going to start off with just introducing Woodburn and myself. If you didn't come to yesterday's session, which was on saving your brand in China, that recording is already up on YouTube. So don't feel like you've missed anything out. But if you don't know who we are, let me just briefly introduce. So Woodburn Accountants and Advisors is specialized in inbound investment into China and Hong Kong. We do the wonderful work of establishing, managing, and administering companies in China and Hong Kong. Usually the services that marketeers or salespeople don't enjoy doing. We do it, and we do it according to our clients' specific requirements, which could include anything from market entry, cross-border investment, tax optimization, corporate restructuring, etc. All of our clients are international companies. They're all looking to develop their businesses into Asia, primarily with the focus of China and Hong Kong. And our clients do everything from manufacturing in China, sourcing in China, selling into China, or providing services on the ground in China. A little bit about myself. My name is Christina Colucci. I'm the head of business advisory at Woodburn Accountants and Advisors, which is my family business. I basically have 15, 16 years of experience in the Chinese market. You can look up my profile, see me on LinkedIn. But what I always like to do when introducing myself is kind of to show people what I've learned in China over the last 16 years of doing business there. And the first thing that I've learned, which was something I had to learn very quickly, was patience. Now, whenever you're doing business in China, because of the speed of the market, and because, you know, we should have been there yesterday is the comment I always get, we forget to be patient. We forget to check things. We forget to realize that this shouldn't be a rushed project. And the Chinese, because it's always a negotiation game, they know how to play off the lack of patience of Westerners. And this is usually their tactic, particularly in negotiations. So definitely the first thing you should ever learn when going into the market is learning patience. The second is an eye on detail, which I hope to learn more from Dominica about in terms of a marketing perspective. But in my industry, which is corporate services, you need to learn to have an eye on detail. You need to be able to read and understand your incorporation documents, your accounting documents, your tax documents. You need to be able to understand everything clearly. So obviously translations are a big factor, but also reading things multiple times to fully understand what you're doing in the Chinese market is critical. There are a lot of things that will pop up along the way when you start reading and you have this eye on detail that you will realize could have been obstacles along your journey in China. And the third thing, which I always tend to joke about, but I really do take it seriously, is in the Western culture, whenever something goes wrong, we always look for someone to blame. Whether it was in your family house, your mom always wanted to know who spilled the spaghetti on the floor. In the corporate world, whenever something falters or suddenly there's an obstacle or something's gone wrong, you're always looking for someone to blame internally for that mistake. This is quite frankly a waste of time in China. Usually what I always tell my clients is, look, blame me. I have no issues being blamed. But let's now move on to a solution. And the beauty of China is that even if you've been hit by a rock and you've got an obstacle in your path, there is always a loophole and there's always a solution. I truly find that is something that is amazing in the Chinese market. So rather than focusing on the past and who is to blame, you need to focus on the solution. How are we going to get over this obstacle? And this is where a lot of time is wasted by a lot of companies and opportunities are missed by focusing on the past rather than looking at the future and seeing what options are available to a company. So I am going to leave it there. But before I introduce Dominica, who will be taking over from today's presentation, I just want to highlight a little bit for those who weren't here yesterday, how Dominica and I got together and the whole point of this webinar series. So what's really interesting is that there are thousands of providers in China, whether it's lawyers, corporate service providers, accountants, auditors, marketing specialists, human resource specialists. There's such a variety on the ground. And you can approach each one individually. But ultimately, to create a solution for your business, you need these people to be talking to each other. And this is how kind of Dominica and I got together, primarily because her focus is on branding and marketing in the Chinese market, and my focus is on helping people expand from a corporate perspective into the market. You can't go into China without the two of those things. And that's what I hope that this webinar series will highlight, is how firms like Dominica's and mine work together to provide these types of solutions to you. So I'm going to stop talking. I'm going to let Dominica take over the discussion for the rest of the session. Dominica?
Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much, Christina. You're a hard act to follow, I have to say. So good morning, everybody. Okay, so marketing in China. So just a little bit about where we sort of got to where we are, Christina and myself. We are a marketing agency, and we specialize in taking American and European brands to China. Now, that could be brands who are predominantly looking to target inbound Chinese to start with and then looking to launch into China, or those that are aggressively looking to launch into China tomorrow. I've worked in the market now for nearly 8 years and recognised about 4 or 5 years ago there was a massive gap in the market. There are lots and lots of providers out there that will help you with social media marketing and search marketing. But that is very much the end of the marketing journey, which you'll hear about a little bit later on. It's very, very important you know who your customers are, what they want, what you should actually be marketing in China, how you should adapt your product, what competition looks like globally in China. And that was the bit that was missing for me. There just weren't any agencies or consultancy firms out there doing the what if, why, but how element of marketing to Chinese consumers. Now, we'll talk a little bit when we go into the session on how the market is changing, and it is changing at an unbelievably massive rate. But it is really worth noting that there has to be a balance between going into the market and going in with some sense of speed, and some sense of, should we say, having a bit of dynamicism about the company, and actually balancing risk. And I'm going to talk quite a lot about that today, because that's probably the biggest question we get asked is, Domenica, we need to go to China, but we're scared, or we need to go to China and we don't know what we're doing. So that's why we set up Emerging Communications, very much with the element of we offer consultative services to clients. Clients that already have existing agencies and they're very happy to use those agencies to deliver marketing, but they need a roadmap, a comms plan, a digital plan, a competitive strategy, whatever it happens to be, any part of the marketing mix. And we also have a services and training division that enables clients to actually get the best out of their marketing channels in market and actually globally, because we target global Chinese. So if you could just move over slides, please, Christina, that'd be great. I think that's the wrong way, maybe. Next one. Okay, next one. Next one. Okay, so in this session, we're going to be looking at the word bonding. I was trying to think of another word, but I can't think of one. It's really, really important to understand that channels come last. And in my session on Thursday, I'm going to be talking about channel strategy, channel marketing, what channels to use, when and how. This session is very much about who is your consumer? How do you find out who your consumer is and how do you target them effectively? And the sorts of mistakes that some of the biggest brands in the world have made. And I have to say, if I've learned one thing over the last 7 years, it's the brands that are the most agile and actually learn well ahead of time of going into the China market, their customer, what their customer wants, that are doing phenomenally well in China. Those that assume that they know their brand and that they know the Chinese consumer are failing, and they're failing big. So we'll talk a little bit about that so that you are not one of those brands. And then onto the most important thing of all, which is how do you cut through the noise? How do you as a brand make sure that you are front of mind and that the consumer targets that you're going for actually want to hear from you, you are resonating with them. And then a little bit about some of the types of sectors that I know are on this call so that it's very relevant for you. We won't discuss specific channels today. I'm doing that on Thursday. This is very much about the right targeting and getting it right with your consumer. Next slide, please. Sorry, next one. Okay, now we all know that China is important, or we wouldn't be on this call. But what a lot of brands fail to recognize is how quickly things are moving in China. I go to China 4 times a year. I have a team out there. Every time I go, oh my goodness, there's something I hadn't recognized. So for example, a year ago, I could survive in China on WeChat Pay. I pay for everything on my mobile. I don't take my purse out with me. And then a year ago, sort of 9 months ago, went back only to find that a lot of places like the railway station won't accept WeChat Pay. They'll only accept Alipay, who are going head to head with each other. That is one tiny example of how the consumer is changing, and the consumer is changing their demands, and so the apps and the suppliers are changing with them. So a lot of people talk about Chinese millennials, and they talk about how important they are. What you need to understand is how incredibly savvy they are, how fussy they are, and how there is competition globally in China amongst every sector on this call. So the biggest assumption that most of our brands make is, but Domenica, we are a well-known brand. Everybody knows who we are. We're not going to have a Chinese name. Everybody knows who we are. Everybody loves us. In fact, we had a few Chinese customers the other day. Well, do not assume. Too many brands have failed by going into China by assuming that you actually have the market sewn up, that you don't have to adapt your product, you don't have to adapt your price, you don't have to think about the colors that you're offering if you're in retail, and that is just simply not true. So just talking about targeting millennials is not enough. Who are you targeting that are millennials? What clusters? How do they behave? Where do they hang out? What are they into? How will you speak to them? Once you've identified what their triggers are, and we're going to talk about that more in a minute, it's really, really, really important that you understand that they have an awful lot of noise and an awful lot of advertising opportunity and an awful lot of brand opportunity in China now, and not from the UK. From Australia, from America, from Italy, from France, from Spain. We are very, very slow to the party here in England. So you need to understand that in order to get cut through, you've really, really got to know what your consumer wants. And also be fair to yourselves and to the company and to the board that if you do not have something that they want, you may well have to tweak it. And I would say 9 times out of 10, that is very often the case. Next slide, please. So, redefine communication. It's really important for a brand to understand that your new consumer, all segments, not just millennials, have an awful lot of choice. So what does that mean for you as a brand? That means that you need to be really agile. So whatever choices you make now, and we'll talk about comms planning and strategy on Thursday, you need to be prepared that they're going to have to change. You're going to have to change with the market. You're a long way from China, 7 hours at the moment, 8 hours soon, and an awfully big distance. And I don't just mean that in terms of miles. So be aware that if you don't have people on the ground and you don't have distributors or agents or anybody feeding back information, you yourself and your team need to spend time in China. You need to see the trends. You need to work with experts that will tell you what those trends are. Don't make assumptions. So be agile with your marketing. So what you know now about your consumer is likely to change. Keep talking to them. That does not have to cost the earth. We'll talk about WeChat on Thursday, but you could do a survey on WeChat. You could do small focus groups, your customers, talk to them. Don't assume that what you're giving them now is going to work in 6 months' time. We're talking about very self-aware individuals who are constantly on mobiles, who are constantly accessible to digital, to other forms of offline communication. Make sure you know what their triggers are, their motivations, so that you can understand why they will buy your product or your service. That is absolutely vital that you understand what it is that motivates them now and in the future. And you have got to move from a mass broadcast to an individual engagement with those consumers. I see too often very, very big brands as well as small brands, but big brands especially, using big 5 agencies globally, not a problem. When they go to China, they fail. And it's because what they try and do is shoehorn their Western social media into China. They think that by purely translating what they're doing on, say, Instagram or Facebook, what they're doing on Google and putting it onto Baidu is going to work, and it doesn't. It just does not gravitate, it does not engage with the consumers because they haven't bothered to find out who the consumers are. Next slide, please. Okay, so common mistakes made, and I'm going to pick 3 big examples here that most of you will have heard of. Next slide, please. Okay, so I would say the most frequently asked question I get at Emerging Communications is brands saying to me, but Domenica, we're not huge. We don't have huge global budgets. We can't possibly do anything in China. And I have to say that is not the case. The one advantage that smaller brands have and medium-sized brands is agility. The ability to mold your product or service to what your customer wants. Now, here's just 3 examples, and there are hundreds, and Christina will be testament to this as well, either brands that didn't get their trademark and then they failed in the market, or here are 3 brands that just didn't find out what the customer wanted. Now, anybody who knows anything about Chinese culture will know that putting sandwiches next to pants or underwear is not a terribly good idea. Marks and Spencer's literally took their European model into China and it failed. They didn't bother to find out what the customer wanted. And for those that understand Chinese consumers and those that even just lunchtime, it is not usual to have a sandwich. You would normally go for something hot. You'd normally take time out because you work very long hours to actually maybe have noodles or soup. And if you are going to have a sandwich, you're certainly not going to want to buy it next to other produce that is not food. They didn't bother to ask what their customers wanted. And they expanded really, really quickly without testing the market. And in fact, they're very successful in Hong Kong because Hong Kong is very, very westernized. But in China, they failed and they retreated and they left. Tesco. Pretty similar. They didn't bother to think about their target market or different types of customers. And actually, they literally translated their name and plonked their Tesco stores in China, hoped for the best. And, well, it cost them an absolute fortune and they retreated. The same with ASOS. Now, ASOS is slightly different. There are a number of retailers on this call, having looked at the list this morning. And ASOS, when it comes to e-com, this is probably the most important thing. And this, again, comes down to your consumers and what they want. In China, your consumers want it now. They want it yesterday. They don't want it tomorrow. So if you are trying to compete with brands on Tmall, you're trying to compete with brands on JD and the logistics that those platforms offer, and then you say, oh, it'll be a few days, oh, it'll be a week, oh, actually, that's out of stock, it will be 3 weeks before you get that pair of trousers, that's just not good enough in China. And what you need to understand is you're up against brands in the e-commerce market that are fast, are agile, are adapting to what the client wants. And what the customer wants. They talk to their customers, they're engaging with them regularly, customer service on WeChat. You can't just shoehorn what you do in America, in Europe, in Australia and think it's going to work in China. If you put your customer first and you actually adapt your product or service to what the customer wants, you will succeed in China. And if you don't, you won't. And it isn't about money, it's actually about talking to your customers. And if you have Chinese customers already, as many of you do, either e-commerce sales or retail, so footfall and customers coming into your stores, or people ringing up and buying professional services who are Chinese, ask them, do a survey, find out what they want, do some market research and find out why they've come to you. Find out what your competitors offer and know where you stand in the market. If you don't, your brand will fail, and if you do, it won't. Next slide, please. So, common myths about marketing in China. I can copy the success of other markets. Now, the most frequent market that our brands try and copy is the US. Domenica, we launched into America. It was such a phenomenal success. It's a sort of similar size to China. There's lots of people there. We really know our stuff. Of which I will say, why are you talking to us then? Because it's been 5 years and you haven't sold anything in China. So please, one thing I would say is China is different. Treat it with the respect it deserves. Understand what your customers want and the landscape in China, and you will be successful. Trying to copy what you've done in other markets simply won't work. Right down to actually, just Christina brought up earlier about translation. I'd go one step further and say copywriting. You're trying to sell products and services. So just getting a Chinese intern within the office to translate copy on your website, on your literature at exhibition stands is not enough. Your copy needs to sell your product. So get a very, very good copywriter in your industry who is a Chinese national to write the copy for you. Don't just think that what you're doing on Instagram and Facebook is going to fly. It has got to be right for your target segment. Other common myths are digital channels. Let's do that first. Let's plan what we're doing on social media. Let's plan what we're doing on search marketing, and which we will say emerging communications because we want good results. Who are your customers? Chinese people, Domenica. Now, who are your clusters? Who are you targeting? What are the hooks? What are they going to buy? Have you asked them? And all too often, Brands will go straight to channel level, launch a very nice social media marketing campaign on Weibo or WeChat, or they will launch a social media campaign, a search marketing campaign, and they'll wonder why it's not working. And that's because there's no brand demand for the product, or there's too much competition, or it's priced wrong. So they haven't done their due diligence. They haven't done their plan. The other thing is e-commerce. Sitting down with Tmall and working out your strategy and getting live on Tmall, that's fantastic. But if you don't do any marketing within Tmall, either merchandising within the platform and marketing to drive demand and brand, nobody's going to know you exist. And in fact, you have got so much competition. I use the analogy, it's like being in Westfield, but without signage. And you would never open a store in Westfield without putting your brand on the outside of the store, or nobody would walk in. It's pretty much the same thing. So be agile and have a plan. Know what your customers want. Things move very fast in China, and there really is this seesaw balancing act between being so slow. I'm talking to brands now I was talking to 7 years ago who still haven't moved. That's too slow. But being so fast that you don't know what your customer wants. So balance it. An average plan, if you are fairly aggressive, might be that you would do strategic planning, set up your channels, your channel planning within, say, 3 months, and be launching in China and be getting some sort of traction between 6 to 12 months after that. That's reasonable. Taking 7 years is too long, taking 1 month too short. So you need to be aware of how long things take. Next slide, please. Okay, so we've talked about targeting. Now let's talk about cutting through the noise. Next slide, please. China. I was in New York a couple of weeks ago, and I could not believe that. It sounds really silly because I spend so much time in China and Hong Kong and Singapore, but China especially. Everything is digitalized in China. Absolutely everything. There's no such thing as static poster panels anymore. You get very, very used to everything being very interactive. You get used to doing everything on your mobile. I pay for dinner on my mobile. I use a mobile to pay for train tickets. I use apps for just about everything, even to get into my office. So in terms of a comm strategy and how it works, it's absolutely vital that you understand that the market in China is different. So we've talked about that. But understanding the drivers of your target segments is also absolutely critical. There is a presumption that the drivers are the same. And I would actually go as far as to say that the drivers for, say, a Chinese student or a Chinese domiciled in the UK who's working and living here is not the same as the driver in China. There is a saying that we often say, which is, that Chinese workers on average will work a 12-hour day on a 6-day week. That is pretty normal. And because WeChat is commonly used as a communication tool for your boss to give you work and for contracts to be sent, it tends to be a 24/7 thing. So if you can understand the drivers and what keeps your target customers awake at night, you'll be a long way into understanding how to adapt your product and your service. And not understanding those triggers is making assumptions, and that is dangerous in my opinion. Don't ever make assumptions about what your customers want. Ask them, do research. And once you have an idea of the triggers, you need to map those triggers with target clusters. Just one retailer we deal with that has one flagship store has 9 personas within the tourism market. So don't think that just breaking it down into Chinese tourists or Chinese domiciled in China or Chinese students or expats is enough. You need to break them down into clusters. How do they behave? Why would they buy your product? Why would they buy a competitive product? And if you do it mood boarded or work with somebody to help you through it, and that will be off the back of the research that you've done. And only then can you look at the right context and the right content. We haven't even got to channel stage yet, because actually a channel is just a conduit for you to communicate information to your target segment, for you to distribute content, but you need to get the content right. And if you look at the examples I gave, Tesco's, if you look at Marks and Spencer's and ASOS, apart from the logistical problem with ASOS, a big issue for them was they didn't know their target customer and they didn't talk to them in the way that they wanted to be spoken to. So context is king. How do you talk to your customer once you know who they are? And that will then drive your content. And then you can go on and you can look at channels and how you're going to target those customers in certain geographies, certain segments, certain behaviors. And then you can look at measuring your KPIs. Your consumers are being bombarded, and I keep saying that, but for those of you on this call that haven't been to China, you absolutely have to go. It's impossible to think about entering China if you don't know what you're dealing with. Just the sheer speed at which things go, the sheer speed at people rush around. There was an advert or an advertising campaign in China, and this is no word of a joke recently, everywhere, and it was actually to encourage people to stop looking at their mobiles while crossing the road because the fatality rate was too high. You're talking about a massive shift in consumerism around everything being done through mobile. So everything you do has obviously got to be through mobile, but it's got to be the right content, talking to the right segment with the right information. Next slide, please. So in terms of strategic output, it's all about your customer. Know who your customer is, your customer segments, what they want, and you will then create the optimal experience for them. They will bond with you, they will engage with you, they will share your content, they will talk about you. When they buy something, they will post about it. It will all be very positive, and it will boost the impact of everything you do because it is relevant. If it's not relevant, don't think that it's all about followers, because that's nonsensical. You can buy followers. It's all about engagement. You want people to start talking about you, share video about you, share photos about you. And then you can start to upweight what works. Let's do more of that. Let's upweight that channel and be prepared to be agile by learning about your customers all the time. Do research at the beginning, do research 12 weeks later, carry on doing research. It doesn't need to be expensive. Ask your customers what they want and make sure you deliver it. Because if you don't, then your competitors will, and they are. If you get the context right, you know your audience, you will be successful. And we've seen it time and time again with even some of the smallest brands. Next slide, please. Okay, so winning Chinese consumers' hearts. Now, I've seen there's lots of questions that have come through, so I'm going to give quite a lot of time to questions at the end. Next slide, please. Okay, on Thursday, I'm going to be talking about channel selection, right channel, right time for the right message to the right target market. But it's worth talking a little bit about content. Don't make a presumption that the content that works in the UK will work in China if translated. All too often, I see some of the most successful viral campaigns in China are, quite frankly, depressing. And in fact, it used to be 6 months, a year ago, we'd talk about chicken soup content, which is happy, loving type content that will make your consumer engage with you. Now, I'm not suggesting that depressing content is going to work for all the brands on this call. It's certainly not going to work if you're a manufacturing brand. It's certainly not going to work if you are some of the professional services, legal services, or something like that. But this was actually for a coffee brand. And this was incredibly successful. And this kind of worked around this 9 to 9, 6 days a week that I talked about that a lot of Chinese workers do. They literally work 24/7, or that's what it feels like. So what they did was they created a viral campaign on WeChat, on Weibo, so on social media, that was all about how hard it is to work in China. And we translated this from Chinese to English, so it's not going to have the same sorts of meaning, but it was like, September, nice to see you. Those who turn me down, thank you, because I'm having a bit of a lie down for the first time today. It's very much focused on the understanding that Chinese workers work too hard. Now, if you notice, there is a tiny logo called Coffee Box, which is a big, it's a viral coffee brand. You can buy it on WeChat. It's the way that a lot of coffee brands are now marketing themselves in China. It's very subliminal. You barely know it's there. And actually, this artwork and illustration and viral piece has done really, really well in China. And the brand's hardly there. It's not in your face. And it's actually focusing on quite negative sentiment. And in the UK, we'd probably think that was a bit, well, I'd think it was a little emotive. I'd go, well, that's a bit depressing, but it works with the Chinese market. And the only reason I put this slide in here is just to show you it's got to be what's right for your target segments, wherever they're residing. So if they're in China and you're targeting clusters within mainland China, know what their triggers are, know what their pain points are, and you can use that as part of your content strategy. But don't presume you know what it is, because it probably is not correct. And don't try and map that with how Chinese might behave in Europe or the UK, because it's not the same. Next slide, please. So without going into too much detail, because I will be talking about more of this with regards to channel strategy, just to emphasize, so many of our brands come to us having failed in China, having just translated from Western platforms, or got a copywriter to write what they like writing that is not what your target segments want to hear. Know who your target segments are, their demographics, their behavior, where they hang out, who they are, what drives them, their triggers. If, for example, let's just take a university as an example, know what study stage they're at, what stage of the buying cycle. Are they researching? Have they already got an offer and you want them to take your offer? Are they already at the university and you want them to tell their friends how amazing it is and be an advocate for you? All of that content is different. So the context at which you use your content is absolutely vital. And understanding their attitudes, their values will also guide the tone that you use. So translation is not enough. It needs to be copywriting. And I would say if you are going to look at where you should be spending your money, it's creative and copywriting. Channel comes last. Channel is just purely a tool to get that content out there. If you don't get the content right, it won't work and it will be a waste of money. So it's about connections with individual target segments, as if you were talking to them in a one-on-one way, so that you can show compassion and empathy and connection and listening. And if what drives them is the fact that they're working 24/7, use that. If what drives them is the fact that they're really scared about making the decision to go to your university, it's a big decision, then it's going to be partly security, empathy, but will they get a job afterwards? All those sorts of things. So it's got to be very specific to the client. And general demographic data won't help you connect. So gone are the days of Mintel where you can go, I'm targeting, I mean, so many people come to us say, I'm targeting millennial women, 18 to 22. That's just not enough. So is everybody else. We've got to know exactly what clusters within that age group we're actually targeting. Next, please. Thank you very much. So I've left some time at the end to take some questions, because I'm very well aware that there have been quite a few come through.
Yeah, even from me.
Oh, okay. Right.
So I just want to highlight one thing that I've learned through Domenica's presentation, which I pretty much highlight in every single presentation that I make. It's do your research.
Yeah.
There is so much that you can do prior to actually setting foot or entering the Chinese market that doesn't have to cost you an arm and a leg, but research does have to happen. And I guess, Domenica, one of my questions for you, particularly because most of the companies that are online are not Marks and Spencers, are not ASOS.
Yeah.
What does it entail actually to do research, to find out who your target market is, or who is that cluster?
Okay, let me take 3 examples of people that I know that are on the call. Let's take a university. I recently wrote an article which I'm happy to share with the delegates today about university recruitment practices. So universities in the UK are quite mature in the Chinese market. They've been doing marketing to Chinese students for a long, long time. But they're an example of, not in the case of the ones we work with, but universities generally will choose the channels first. The digital department will drive the strategy. They will be doing work on Baidu, which is Google equivalent, and on social media. But what they don't do is they don't actually talk to their students that are actually on campus. It costs nothing. Most universities have a film crew. I don't think I've got a university that doesn't have at least one videographer. You can go out on campus, especially in Freshers Week. You can talk to new students. You can find out why they chose the university. You can actually get their permission and use that as part of your marketing to get other students to engage with you. The other thing is you can actually create student ambassadors for each faculty, Chinese students that are at the university, to talk about and to engage with you. And they are probably one of the best research sources for you. So that's just one example. When we work with retailers, one of the things that we do if they're looking, for example, at step 3 will be e-commerce, step 2 is cross-border, step 1 they know they've got Chinese customers. Talk to them. Do research. We're currently down in Portsmouth today doing some research for a retail chain, actually talking to their existing sales staff, some that speaks Mandarin, some that don't, and customers. We're actually going around the shopping centre and talking to customers. You do not need to spend the earth. You do not need to do great, big, complicated focus groups or quant surveys. And if you've got WeChat and you've got a certain number of followers, so let's talk B2B. We've got a B2B client and we're actually doing a questionnaire to their WeChat followers to decipher, A, who the followers are, because WeChat is just a WeChat ID, and how they're behaving. So in actual fact, it doesn't need to be complicated. You don't need to go to PWP, WPP or PwC or go to a big research firm, spend £100,000 to do it. It's about being smart. The reason I use the big examples in there of those that have failed is the big guys fail because they are actually assuming they know their customer. And those that don't assume and actually find out who their customers are and what they want are being really successful. And it's not the big guys necessarily. It's actually those that are doing their research before they go into market. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I actually would like to just give another example, actually from my husband. My husband works for Ferrero. It's a chocolate brand, Nutella, Tic Tac, Kinder. And just highlighting on Domenica's point of view, you don't even have to outsource this. You can do it yourself. So my husband, even though he works for Ferrero, going supermarket shopping with him is a nightmare because he will spend 45 minutes of his own time going up and down the sweets aisle to investigate how other brands have been marketing, what are the price points, and also just staring at the consumers who are going up and down those aisles and seeing who they are. And this is something he does on his own time, but he does these investigations on his own. Obviously, Ferrero is a big enough firm that they do outsource these studies. But, you know, for him, it's also just getting a feel of the market and doing it himself. And he'll go to different supermarket chains, the locals, the foreign, you know, the big retailers, etc., just to get that impression and get that feel. So I completely agree with Domenica on that point. Domenica, there was one point you highlighted at the beginning of your presentation which caught my attention. And I just wanted to see what you say to customers that approach you. So you said, you know, most customers will come to you from the UK, from the US, who say, anyway, we're such a huge brand globally, so we'll just go in. How can you tell a customer or a retailer or a brand that they're not big in China? I mean, that's probably the first starting point to kind of say to someone, you're not big. So how do you, without actually investing anything yet in the market, how can they figure out that they're not big?
We can do a desktop audit, which doesn't take very long. We obviously do more detailed ones, but you can have a look, for example, search volume on Baidu, which is Google equivalent. It's got 78% market share in China, and see if anybody's actually searching for your product or your service. We can do sentiment analysis on Weibo, which is one of the big social media platforms in China, and we can have a look at who is talking about the brand. Are they talking about it positively or negatively, or are they talking about it at all? And if the brand will give us a competitive set, we're currently doing this with a retailer at the moment, and we are looking at where they sit so we can benchmark them from day one versus their competitors. But what I do say to brands is, just give me all of your competitors and we'll work out who you're competing with in China, because it's a completely different competitive set. And quite often you're not competing with who you're competing with in Europe, because you're competing with Australian and American brands who are a lot more established within China. So I would say do an audit, a desktop audit. There's much more deeper stuff that we do for brands where we need to do very full-blown research and to see how established they are, but quite often we will get the results quite quickly and know that there is no demand. Similarly, and this comes back to your trademark thing yesterday, and this is more about a retail brand than anything else. When we do that research, we'll quite often find that if there is demand, the demand is not being driven through the brand, it's being driven through Daigou, which is shopping agents. So you might not think that you have, so just as we have people saying our brand's really established, Domenica, there's loads of demand, and we find there isn't. We also, when we're doing audits for brands in order to start putting together a strategy, we might find that actually there is a demand for their brand, but in the wrong way, because people are either selling it through shopping agents, or they have actually, we had an instance recently where they hadn't trademarked and somebody had completely copied the brand, copied the logo, and the only difference was one letter on the English word. So complete copycat, and it's too late. There's nothing they can do about it. In fact, we'll talk about it afterwards. There's nothing they can do about it because it's too established in China. And it is so similar, and that's because they didn't trademark and they didn't look after themselves and they didn't do their due diligence. So in actual fact, it can work both ways, but it's really important that you do your research to actually establish where you are. What's the demand? Is there any demand? And if there is demand, where's it coming from? And how are people getting hold of the product? A lot of brands that have been really successful, so that's the negative side. The positive side of being really successful are ones that have actually become successful by accident. We've got a number of brands who suddenly, and again, this is all about data, so look at your data, and they had a look at their e-commerce sales and they noticed there was a spike and all the names weren't English and they looked Chinese, and then when they looked at the shipping address, they were all in China, mainland China. They'd done no advertising whatsoever, couldn't understand it, came to us. We did our research, and it transpired that a student customer based in the UK had become a real advocate for the brand, had started selling the brand to their friends, again became a Daigou. And so what we did was we chose to engage with the said customer, and that customer is now an advocate for the brand. So we are controlling the way that they are marketing the brand as opposed to them controlling the way they're distributing the brand. So it's all about research, really, whether that it doesn't have to cost the earth, and a lot of it can be done digitally. We've got a lot of tools that we use to establish what the brand presence is, what the sentiment is. So you might have presence, but the sentiment may not be great. And this comes back to trademarking, actually. We had a jeweler who average cost of a necklace is 150k, jeweler to the Queen, and they hadn't done a Chinese name and they hadn't trademarked. So in actual fact, what happens is your customers will create a brand for you if you don't do it yourself on social media. They'll create a name for you, and when we tried to trademark them and their name, the name that everybody knew them as was more sort of H. Samuels, which is, of course, is a very low-end jewellery brand, absolutely perfectly fine high street, but not £150,000 worth of fine. So it's really important that you do all that at the beginning as well. It's just to make sure that you are protecting yourself before you do any marketing. But it's a lot of it can be done online, in answer to your question. A very long answer to your short question.
We've got one question that's come in about the Chinese entry strategy. And the question is whether the marketing side of it should be driven by the digital team. Who should be the driver when going into the market in terms of the marketing side of things?
That's very interesting. So what tends to happen is digital markets or digital marketers will come to us and say, I want to do a paid search campaign in China, can you do it for us? So they're looking over here. So in answer to your question, and it's not an easy answer, is everybody. And when I say everybody, I don't mean the entire organization. I mean depending totally on your brand. So if your retail ops must be involved, as well as marketing, as well as digital. If you're a university, you also need to involve international as well. And you need to involve undergrad, postgrad, and get the whole team together. And if you're, say, B2B or professional services, you definitely need to involve other board divisional heads as well as digital. The reason for this is every decision you make when you put together a China strategy is going to touch on other divisions, whereas in the UK it doesn't necessarily. So you can't make a decision on your channel strategy driven by digital if your pricing or your product need adapting, which comes back to the customer. And then that is going to touch on marketing and merchandising and all the other departments within the organization. So everybody needs to be driven by a strategic plan. Once the plan is signed off, digital can drive it. So we tend to look at it strategic versus tactical, and digital will set the KPIs with the ops department, depending on what sector we're in. So in all honesty, it's got to be a group thing. Now, when we onboard clients, we onboarded a university 2 weeks ago. 18 people were at the onboarding meeting, spanning international, undergrad, postgrad, marketing, digital, customer service and market research. Now, you might say that's ludicrous. A lot of work for us. We flew 4 people there. But the actual reality is the plan is going to be integrated. It's going to appease all the departments, and we are going to hit the KPIs, because we're not going to get halfway down the road to find that there is an issue within one department that we haven't thought about. So the strategy should be driven at senior management level, and once signed off, it can be delivered by the digital department. That's your ideal, if possible.
Great. So now another question that came in, which I find quite funny. I'm overwhelmed. Where do I start? How do I start? What do I need to do to begin this journey of marketing to the consumers?
Okay, so it can seem overwhelming, but actually I would say it's not. It's really, and it's not because I do that for a living, but it's actually really simple. And people that overcomplicate it don't do very well. If you bring it back to real simplicity, and I would say this: who is your customer? Customers. Find out who they are. What do they want? Basic marketing. Forget about tactics at this point. What do they want, and do we have something that they want? And once you've established that, you know who your customers are, what drives them, and what you want. So most organizations have got market research departments that could do this for them, or you can do some of the market research techniques that I suggested. How do you compete? So if you don't know, get somebody to do some research for you. As I said, if you know how you compete, what your drivers are and who your customers are, you can put together a plan and get somebody to help you with that. So you can then work out what content is going to be driven through what channels, which I'll be doing on Thursday. It really isn't any more difficult than that. You would not go into Russia without a business plan, or go into America without a business plan. All we're talking about is a marketing plan in all essence, is to understand what product is going to go to what customer, through what distribution channel. It's the basic marketing mix. But all too often, brands focus so much on the promotions, they forget about who they're talking to. And what we've done with brands that are overwhelmed and don't have much in the way of budget is we focus on one target segment, the most lucrative, the lowest hanging fruit. And it could be that that segment's actually here, and we sell to them first, we learn from them, and then that drives what we're going to sell in China, and that works really, really well for a lot of brands. And it's obviously the lowest risk and lowest investment, and gives you the most competitive customer insight. So what I would say is, don't be overwhelmed, but don't do it on your own. I think all too often it's left to the digital departments. And if that's the case, share this webinar with ops and marketing and explain that you can't do the strategy without their input, because it's actually really, really important that the product and service is tailored to your customers. I hope that helps, but it is actually not overwhelming if you sit down and write it down, and do that before you start thinking about tactical outreach.
I think there are a couple of points there that makes me or that highlights how much I really enjoy working with Dominica, because she reiterates what I tell people. Have a business plan, have a strategy. That's actually the first step for everyone. I think the amount of people that come to me who are so excited and so excited to get into China and go there, but don't have a business plan, don't have a budget in place, haven't done their research, etc. It's so vital. You have to prepare before you go somewhere. You can't just come in and think everything is going to be easy. And I think that's something that really needs to be taken into consideration for everyone. The last question before we've got to end, and again, there have been a lot of questions coming in throughout this Q&A, so please remember, Dominica will come back to you. But I do want to highlight something because a couple of people have actually mentioned it, and the issue is language. I have people here saying, how do we solve the fact that everything needs to be in Chinese if we don't speak in Chinese? I have others who are saying we've hired Chinese interns, and we've put them in charge of the Chinese market because we thought it would lower cost. How do we get, we don't know actually if there's a result or no result. So language seems to be a big issue for a lot of people. How do you go about explaining that or calming companies down on that?
Yeah, it's the biggest threat, but I think the biggest opportunity for brands. So, firstly, let's answer the first question first. As we've talked a lot about today, strategy. If you are going to have somebody in-house that's an intern, that's a graduate, postgraduate, then for goodness sake, have a strategy, because you can't expect them to do that too, because they are junior in marketing senses. And I'll give you an example. I've got 22 staff here just in London who are on tier 2 visas. They've all got MBAs and postgrads, but they're no use to me in an agency until they've worked for me for at least 18 months, 2 years. So it gives you an idea what the level they have to be at. So don't make that fourth, member of staff feel that they've got to come up with a strategy, because they won't be able to. So get a strategy done elsewhere if you want to do it in-house. Also, if the strategy is done elsewhere, including content planning and all the segments we talked about, it means that what they do is going to deliver, as opposed to what they're trying to do, which is basically just pump out information. Secondly, get a copywriter in-house, not an intern. They can, by all means, be a graduate in journalism or something like that, but make sure they can write. And if you don't know how to recruit somebody, that's one of the things that we've done for a number of clients recently, one including a wine brand, where we help them recruit. In fact, we've done it 8 or 10 times this year, help somebody recruit, help them with a JD, help them interview, help them get the right person. And we are effectively an objective resource every quarter or every month, however it's going to work for the organization, to check the quality of what they're delivering. So you will, if you don't speak Chinese, need somebody to objectively check and almost mentor and monitor what they're doing. We even went as far as we actually had a member of staff on secondment for a whole year with a client, and now they've replaced her, and so basically they didn't know where to start. So there are ways around it. But not having somebody too junior and not having somebody that just knows the language is not enough. They've got to be able to write. The rest can be outsourced, but writing in-house is fairly important. So even if it's just customer service inquiries, and having somebody on the phone that speaks Chinese is probably the most important thing. But again, happy to talk to anybody that's got that question, because it will depend on where you are in the market, your sector, and what you're trying to do is to the best option that I would give you. But yes, it's not just about the language, it's about the ability to do the job.
I actually just want to highlight 2 points on that question also. It's the key of being successful in China is finding the right people. So interns are not the right people because they're not permanent within your organization. They are people who are rotating around. So I know a lot of companies that do intern programs where every 3 months you're getting a new intern. How do you expect the strategy to be implemented if you're constantly having someone who's being rotated every three months? It just doesn't work. And having someone who's had China experience is also critical. I mean, someone who's actually traveled and set foot in the country is also something that's really important. And understands the market or just has seen it, so they have a feeling of what it's like. Finding the right people or having the right people on staff that can lead your China strategy in whatever aspect, whether it's marketing, the legal side or the accounting sides, it's really important. I can't emphasize that more myself. Interns should be support systems. They should not be the ones that are fulfilling and implementing strategies.
I totally agree. Can I just interject there just to say it also goes for brands that give their distributors or agents the power to market their brand in China. This is where the biggest unraveling of, I don't know quite how to put this, of is probably the biggest problem we face with brands that are doing well in China or not so well. They're selling products or services in China via distributors or agents, and I say, well, who's managing your WeChat? Because it's got on here that they had dinner last night and that they just got engaged to their girlfriend, and totally and utterly inappropriate content. Oh, my agent runs on WeChat. WeChat or Weibo are marketing channels and they're an extension of your brand. So you do not give the role of your brand ambassador in China to somebody who's effectively a salesperson. And we've had worse than that. We worked with a bed brand, a huge bed brand, did some research in market, only to find, because they didn't have their own corporate WeChat channel, that their staff were contacting prospects coming into the store with their own WeChat and then selling them other stuff, shoes, houses, you name it. So be very, very careful. And again, it comes down to having a strat plan and who's going to do what. And use your agents and distributors as salespeople, but don't let them control your brand. They're not marketers. It's really important to know the distinction.
I think control is a big aspect.
Yeah, absolutely.
You should have control over your WeChat accounts. You should have control over content. You need to keep control of these things. Also, and again, this comes to the point of one thing that I've learned over my time in China. It's to have an eye on detail. Don't ignore. Be part of the journey and be aware of what's happening around you and what's being said about your company. And if you are the brand yourself as an individual, then you should definitely be interested in what's being said about you, or how your brand is being promoted locally. Even if you don't speak Chinese, there's ways of people informing you of what's being said and how it's being said. So
absolutely.
I don't we've already gone 1 minute over the hour. So I just want to highlight, for those of you that are from the UK, Dominica and I are going to be sitting around a table. Welcome to answer any further questions. Go through some troubleshooting. We're organizing this roundtable event in central London on the 30th of October from 12 to 2 p.m. So within your lunch hour, please come down. You can register for the event with Jenny at emergingcomms.com. And I did get this question yesterday. It's a free of charge event. It's a type of follow-on from this webinar series specifically for those that are based out of the UK. Hopefully when we have the time, we'll spread that out to other jurisdictions at some point. But for the moment, it is for the UK. It's an opportunity to meet both Dominica and myself, again, 30th of October in central London during lunch. And again, we'll be happy to discuss more. I mean, we can go on for hours regarding all of these subjects within these last 4 webinar series. So Dominica, thanks a lot for today's presentation. Greatly appreciated it. There are questions that have been not answered. Dominica will come to you either by today or certainly within this week to answer all of them. Please be patient. The recording will be going up on YouTube shortly, and everyone who has registered and participated will get a copy of the PDF of this PowerPoint. Please join us for the next 2 sessions. I hope you're all gaining some value out of it, but tomorrow we will be talking about what type of business models you can create cost effectively for marketing in China. And then on Thursday, we will be talking about the various marketing channels that do exist. So don't forget, if you haven't registered yet, please do register. There is still time. So again, I want to thank everyone for joining us. And Dominica, thanks a lot for today's presentation. It was amazing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christina, and thank you everybody who joined this call.
And see you tomorrow.